Unit 7, the coordinate plane, Lesson 3, functions. We have 3 vocabulary words. The first one is a function. This is a rule that assigns exactly one output value to each input value. So it's just an input-output table that you guys have done before. You may have called them input-output machines. You may even use the word function and called them function machines. So a function is just a rule, such as this example, like x plus 6 equals y. So whatever x is, we're going to plug it in. We're going to add 6, that's the rule, to get y. We have independent variables, which is our input. Okay, our input, remember, is our x value. This does not depend on the other variable for its value. That's why it's called independent. Then we have the dependent variable output, which is our y. This is dependent on what the input variable is. So y, if we look at our function up here, y is going to be determined by whatever x is. If x is 2 and we add 6, then that's going to make y 8. But if x was 1 and you're adding the 6, then y is 7. So y, that output, is dependent on whatever that independent variable, that input x, is. We're going to talk about those today in this lesson. You can use your smart device, scan the QR code to watch the Virtual Nerd video on what is a function. Here's something that you guys may be used to in elementary school, just like what I said, those function machines or input-output machines. You input, which is our x, you input a value. The function is that rule, okay, or that operation, something's happening to it mathematically. And then the output is our y. So suppose you tell the machine to multiply by 4. That would be your rule or your operation. This function table right here is going to show that input and output video, or values, not video, excuse me. So if I input 3, so if we put input 3 here and it multiplies by 4, 3 times 4 is 12. So our x, our input's 3, and our y, our output, is 12. If we input -7, and you did that on your calculator to make sure you get it correct, you have -7 times 4, you get a -28. Completing a function table, input, remember, is your x value into the function. You're going to perform that function, and then you're going to get the output, or your y. That y value is also called this right here, which is f of x, or the function of x. Now this is I know we're in secondary math, but it is an upper level term. But it is going to be one that you may see when we look at these function tables, so you need to get used to looking at that. So it may look like this. Function of x equals x times a -2. Well, remember that function of x is just our output, our y. So here's our y, so you can just simply replace it. The y is x times -2. Or if we use the words output, input, our output is going to follow this function rule. Whatever our input x is, times -2. So they completed the table below here following this rule right here. So whatever they input, -1, they took it times a -2, and they got our output. And that output is our f of x, or our y. And they continued that pattern to complete the table. So we're going to do that right here. Remember, our input is our x and our output is our y, or we can also call it the function of x. We have our output, which is the function of x, equals input times 5. So what we're going to do is take our x and we're going to input it, -3, and we're going to take it times 5. So we're going to take -3 times 5, which gives us a -15. That would be our output. We're going to plug in wherever our input is, our value of 1 here. So we have 1 times 5, which gives us 5. And our last one here, 7. 7 times 5 is 35. And you can do the same thing here. So I want you to pause the video, take a minute, and complete this function. Remember, the output's f of x. Your input is x. That helps. This is x. This is y, or you can call it f of x. Get used to hearing that f of x for that output. If you need your calculator to help to multiply or divide with your negatives, that's certainly fine. So again, pause the video, take a few minutes, and complete Table 2. Now we're going to talk about identifying those independent and dependent variables. Now going back to the definitions, remember independent variables does not rely on the other variables. It's independent, it's all by itself. The dependent variable does depend on that. Independent is your x, your dependent is your y. So looking here at this practice, we want to identify the independent and dependent variables. So here on number 3 it says the total cost of clothing you purchase at a store and the number of clothing items you buy. So what would be your independent variable, IV, and what would be your dependent variable, DV? Well, my independent, okay, remember, is not dependent on anything else. So what in these two situations is dependent on the other? Well, my total cost of clothing, total cost, is going to be dependent, okay, it's going to depend on how many or the number of items I buy, right? If I buy less, my total is going to be less. If I buy more, my total is going to be more. So my total cost is dependent to the number of items I buy. And if I was to plot this on a coordinate plane or on a coordinate grid, my DV, my dependent, my total cost is going to be my y on my y-axis, and my IV will be on my x, be my x-axis. I'd like you to pause the video, take a look at number 4, and see if you can identify the independent variable and the dependent variable in this situation. Lastly, we're going to talk about writing equations for functions. So this is where we're going to determine the independent x and the dependent y variables and write a rule for them. Basically, our tables are complete here. And what we need to do is find out what's happening to x in order to get y. We started out with -3 and we ended up with 12. What happened? If it's hard for you to look at the negatives, see if you can look at the positives here. We start out with 4 and we get 19. What happens? When you increase in value, remember, an increase in value means we either added or we multiplied. And if you decrease in value, that means you had to have subtracted or divided to get your value. So I go from a negative to a positive. That's an increase. I go +4 to a +19. That's going to be an increase. I go from a +15 to a +30. That's an increase. Now, looking here, when we look at our pattern, it has to go for each one of these. The rule has to work for all 3. So when I'm looking, I'm going to start with the easiest here, is 15 to 30. I know that I can take 15 times 2 and get 30. However, if I take 15 times 2, it gives me 30. But if I take 4 times 2, that does not give me 19. So timing, multiplying, is not going to work. So I need to look at addition. What plus 15 gives me 30? Well, if I add 15 to 15, I get 30. Can I add 15 to 4, and does that give me 19? Yes. If I add 15 to -3, does it give me a +12? Yes. So my rule here is add 15. I want you to take a minute or 2, and I want you to complete the next function table's rule. Look at the pattern, see what is happening, and see if you can find the rule. Remember, it's going to be, excuse me, either add, subtract, multiply, or divide by a value that continues the pattern. Our input's x, our output's y. What are we doing to x to get y? Once you're done with this table, you have finished the lesson on functions.